Let's go to our panel now. Joining me from Bogota, Colombia, Raul Gallegos, who is an associate director at Control Risks. It's a political risk analysis firm. And in Mérida, Venezuela, Paul Dobson is there. Paul is a journalist working for VenezuelaAnalysis.com. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Raul, I have to start with you because you're the skeptic. You don't believe that this was an assassination attempt, do you? Why not?
You know, a lot of observers are skeptics in the sense that, we've heard in the past, both from President Maduro and from President Chavez, that they have been essentially the target of attacks on their lives. And repeatedly, this has happened over a long period of time. However, very little solid evidence has been produced over time. And so I think it's natural that a number of observers overseas and locally tend to take this with a certain grain of salt. That's not to say that there is not an opposition and there aren't very radical people that desire ill to the president, but certainly having seen this recurrently, it's reasonable to expect that a lot of people will express a certain level of skepticism toward this.
Paul, has the Attorney General presented any hard evidence yet, apart from saying that people have been detained, that they know from where the drones were flown? Is there any hard evidence?
Yes, well, last night the President of Venezuela received permission from the Attorney General to publicly disclose some of the evidence which is part of the investigation, which he claimed is very advanced. He spoke to the nation and he disclosed numerous videos, original videos, two of which were confessions from those who have been arrested as part of the operation. There was also a series of audios, telephone audios, used amongst the groups which carried out the bomb attack. And there was a series of other elements, vehicles, munitions, and so on, from those involved, those who have already been arrested, which corroborate both the popular videos that we've seen of the events, and also the commentaries from those who have claimed responsibility for this crime.
Yeah, Raul, you talked about the opposition. Who are the known groups who have, because you need both the ability and the desire to carry out an assassination, if that's what this was, but who are these groups that are known to have both of these qualities that would be required? Our position certainly is that based on what we've seen so far from the opposition in Venezuela, it doesn't seem like there is leadership that is strong enough and certainly radical enough to attempt something of this nature or to attempt the assassination of the president. We haven't seen any groups, similar to, actual guerrilla groups the way we've seen in Colombia, the FARC, the ELN. I mean, there's no real established insurgency that we can identify yet. However, on the other hand, we have seen, I think one of the interesting things is the fact that, the Venezuelan government is well known to have a very effective intelligence apparatus, a very effective communications and propaganda apparatus. And I think that when you look at how this has played out and how the government is acting in response, I think a lot of people are expecting essentially the government to use this opportunity to gain increasing control, to establish its control of government, of the institutions, and its influence over the private sector as well, which is what we naturally expected to happen after Maduro essentially managed to become president again. Paul, what do you make of that? Because, I mean, apart from what seems to be at the moment, before the investigation is complete, apart from what appears to be a knee-jerk reaction from Maduro that Juan Manuel Santos, now the ex-president of Colombia, that Venezuelan opponents living in the United States, the far-right groups in the country are all behind this, the opposition sees almost everything that happens to Maduro and everything that he does as an attempt to stay in power while the country seems to be cracking up around him.
Yeah, well, I think firstly I'd like to make a comment on something Raul just said. Maduro didn't manage to make himself president again. Maduro was elected in a free and fair popular election, which all of the international observers who were in the country at the time declared was transparent.
Yeah, hold on, Paul, listen, it may have been free and fair, it may have been transparent, but the whole world that follows Venezuela knows that most of the opposition weren't even standing because they're either in prison, they're in exile, or they were barred from office. So sure, he won the election, but it wasn't totally above board in terms of who his competitors were. So fine, he was elected, But let's look at what's happening now as he's the president again.
At the moment, he has pointed the finger to a right-wing deputy called Juan Requences, who was arrested last night, who was named by one of the suspects one of the accused involved in this assassination attempt directly. They're currently questioning this member of parliament. And there's a few other names which have been publicly knocked around by, again, those accused of being involved in this criminal activity. This isn't the first time we've seen the Venezuelan opposition take violent means to try to assume power. The group which has claimed responsibility for this attack, which is a small group of right-wing activists called Soldiers in T-shirts, have publicly said that the objective is to call people onto the streets for the taking of power. Last night, President Maduro, in his address to the nation, said that it's one thing to have a debate of ideas with argument, it's another thing to use violent methods to take power. I remind your viewers that in 2014 and in 2017, the Venezuelan opposition, the right-wing extremists, led violent actions against the government, which included bombing or attempts to bombing public institutions, primary schools, public transport networks, barricades set up in the streets, and there were numerous deaths caused by these actions. And the objective of these actions was to overthrow a democratically elected government.
This is to both of you, but Paul, let's start with you. What might the death of Nicolas Maduro achieve? Would it even end the socialist program of the Venezuelan leadership?
The Venezuelan constitution says that in the case of an absolute void of power, which of course the death of a president would invoke, the vice president will assume power until new elections will be held, which will be in I think, 3 or 6 months' time. So this is the constitution. What would happen? Whether the opposition, the right-wing forces, who, as we've seen, as I just explained, don't necessarily believe in the constitutional methods to assume power, whether they would respect these or whether they would then try to install a coup d'etat, as they did in 2002, is up to them. But the ethos, at least last year when we saw this big uprising against the government by the right-wing extremists, the ethos from across the board in Venezuela, from the average people on the street, was the necessity to impose an ethos of peace, an ethos of debate and discussion, and that's the way in which we should resolve issues, not through bombing, not through violence. And this is a message which was reiterated by the president last night.
Raul, do you think the country might change direction if Maduro were to die before his term were to be up? Let's say that assassination attempt was successful. What would happen in Venezuela? What's your reading of that?
Based on what we're seeing right now, if we're completely honest regarding the forces on the ground, what we're seeing is a very demoralized, broken, and divided opposition that doesn't really have. Well, first of all, the leading figures are either in jail or either disqualified from running for office. So it's very unlikely that you will have an opposition that would stand ready to, take over government, if you will, or have the opportunity to even reach that point. I think the more likely situation would be if, and based on the Constitution as it's currently being read by this government, what we would have is that the president would no longer be there, and then you would probably have a number of groups within Chavismo that would rise to the occasion. Delcy Rodriguez is vice president. That means that her and her brother, which are very strong players, would be in a very good position to take over power. You also have Diosdado Cabello, who's the second most powerful man in government right now by running the Constitutional Assembly. I think it's important to note that the Constitutional Assembly has the power to actually take over and sideline the president if it chose to do so. So there are a number of groups within Chavismo that could stand in a good position to succeed Maduro if that came to pass, if you will. However, we do see a successful coup as a very unlikely situation right now, given how strongly Maduro and his collaborators have managed to retain control of pretty much all the levers of power and have a very strong alliance still within the military, despite talk of the fact that there is discontent within the military, which is normal. I mean, there is discontent within the larger population. But from discontent to an actual successful ability to remove the president forcefully, I think that's another matter.
Paul, you're on the ground there. Is there any way to gauge the popularity of Nicolas Maduro? Is the press free in Venezuela? Are there any credible opinion polls that show what especially this may have done to the feeling of the people towards him, what happened on Saturday at that rally?
Well, obviously, it's too early to have opinion polls and so on conducted after the events of Saturday. The general feeling here on the ground, speaking to people, I work as an independent journalist here, the general feeling on the ground is that in those who supported Maduro, who historically supported the Bolivarian process here, it has stirred a patriotic feeling, and there's a certain amount of rallying of the troops behind Maduro. There is also a middle sector of the population, which the neither nor sector, who neither feel strongly for the opposition or the government, but who are expressing very clearly that maybe while they don't necessarily agree with the policies of Maduro, they are definitely against the methods used by those who attempted to kill him. And the return to violence is something that they will vehemently reject. There is also a very, very minor sector of the population, the right-wing extremists, who basically believe that any method is valid as long as it gets rid of the president. And these are people, you have seen commentaries here in Venezuela on the social networking especially, who say, you know, what a shame this attempt failed. So these are sort of pro-violent opinions, which is, I stress, a small minority of the population. The vast majority of the population condemns the method used, regardless of their opinion of Maduro and his policies. The latest opinion polls, if you like, we have on Maduro's popularity would be the most recent election, which was May 20th, with a low turnout compared to Venezuelan standards, but a high turnout compared to most other countries, including European countries, in which he ran against two opposition candidates and one other Chavista candidate, and he won a very significant majority. So this is the latest figure which we can use to judge his popularity. But obviously, like I say, the effect of the bombing attack on Saturday is too early to tell.
You know, we've been talking about political philosophies and the antagonism that the Maduro government is creating amongst its opponents, Raul. But then when you look at everyday life in Venezuela, and of course it's widely reported almost weekly about these huge inflation rates that some project by the end of the year will be 14,000% for the year 2018. Would the divisiveness being felt in society be suppressed greatly if people weren't suffering so much in their daily lives? And then, therefore, there comes the question, how much is Maduro to blame for the economic meltdown of the country, which no one can deny? Even he, the president, doesn't deny it.
Yes, I think what's undeniable is that the current crisis stems in large part from a number of policies that have created distortions in the economy. I think that's undeniable unless we don't believe in incentives. If we believe in incentives, we know that, you know, companies cannot produce goods below cost because no one produces at a loss. Companies cannot produce goods if they don't have access to foreign currency to import raw material and finished products. Companies won't invest if they feel that their assets are going to be seized and their employees are going to be arrested. If they are accused of, you know, sabotaging the economy for not producing enough, even though they lose money doing so. You know, there is something to economic logic. There is something to incentives, and that's just human nature. And so I think that a number of these policies, capital controls, price controls, nationalizations maintained over time have led to what we're seeing today, coupled with obviously oil prices declining. I mean, it's undeniable.
Raul Gallegos, Paul Dobson, thank you very much.